all sorts of really kind of world-changing ideas came out of really this one laboratory during these few decades here in New Jersey between 1945 and really 1975.
Technology has always created a level of fear and concern and anxiety. And it's the creation of the unknown.
Do you think comparing New Jersey in the 19th century to sort of a modern-day Silicon Valley is too simplistic, or do you think it has some merit?
I think it's really valuable. I mean, in the sense that we can sort of see how the pursuit of new technology kind of evolves over time.
Even a comedian like me knows that New Jersey is America's favorite butt of the joke. But that is all gotta stop. And the Garden State Roots podcast is here to tell you why. Because it turns out, my friends, New Jersey has been a major revolutionary force for 2.5 centuries now. From music, to film, to sports, to tech, and from food to politics. Join me, Justin Williams, to explore Jersey's most revolutionary historical moments and figures over 8 episodes of gutsy game changers and amazing catalysts. Garden State Roots is digging up some stories. Okay, so in this episode, we're exploring how New Jersey helped to get the world talking. And for a clue as to how that happened, take a listen to this groundbreaking broadcast from 1946.
On Friday of this week, the world read the startling news that radar contact has been made with the moon. We have our microphones placed in the little 20 by 40-foot wooden building of the Evans Laboratories at Belmar, New Jersey, where this experiment was successfully completed.
To think such a simple sound has traveled thousands of miles up into space before bouncing off the moon and back down to Earth to be heard by my ear. I know, a smartphone does this a million times a day, but all of that is arguably because of technology like this, made right here in Jersey. That's right, this is the story of how New Jersey got the world talking, so listen up. Joining me is Jon Gertner, journalist and author of The Idea Factory, and Rayvon Fouché, professor at Northwestern University and author of Black Inventors in the Age of Segregation. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
I'm going to start by taking us back to when New Jersey came into being 250 years ago, 1776, when it took a week to send a letter from Newark to somewhere like Baltimore, for example. And that was only if the weather was good. If it rained and the mail horse got stuck in the mud, it would take twice the time. New Jersey contributed to a communications revolution back then, but who were the individuals in this era? Rayvon?
I think we'd like to start with a man named Isaac Collins, who launched the first statewide newspaper, the New Jersey Gazette, around 1777. He initially moved to Burlington, New Jersey from Philadelphia for a new job printing money for King George III. But during the Revolutionary War, when the British captured and suppressed New York and Philadelphia newspapers, Collins began printing his newspaper from Trenton. The Gazette provided a lifeline of information and support to George Washington's movement, spreading the American ideals of political liberty and independence. It also started a press revolution in New Jersey. More state newspapers, like the Journal, the Brunswick Gazette, and the Trenton Mercury, launched within the decade. New Jersey went from a news and information desert to a vibrant hub of original journalism.
Little facts for you guys. New Jersey's Historical Commission, the makers of this podcast, called their online newspaper the New Jersey Gazette in honor of Collins's paper. Collins's house in Burlington is on the National Register of Historic Places for those interested to visit, so go check it out if you can. Rayvon, is it right to say that Collins was a complicated figure?
Though he really begins New Jersey journalism and the launching of New Jersey's newspapers, it was not all good. Collins also ran ads for slave auctions and efforts to recapture runaway slaves, which is deeply troubling. But at the same time, it was a business focused on making money. But one person that is relevant that, in a sense, pushes against this narrative of Collins is Trenton native R. Henry Herbert, who in 1880 published one of the state's first Black-owned newspapers. The newspaper supported Republican political agendas, such as campaigning for the desegregation of schools. This effort would materialize in the School Desegregation Act of 1881, which gave Black parents the option of enrolling their children in schools previously reserved for only white children. So he helped contribute to this new revolution, opportunities for Black folks across the state of New Jersey.
A good choice, Rayvon. John, how in your mind did New Jersey take communication forward in this era?
I think the sort of bridge between print and early communication by letters and this sort of modern era of phone calls and telecommunications and digital information is really the telegraph. New Jersey had played a part in that. I mean, really, the limitations of the telegraph were that it could, only send messages, dots and dashes. I've sometimes compared it to kind of like texting, but without emojis. So, the great limitations of the telegraph were that, or the great breakthrough of the telegraph was that it could, eventually send messages coast to coast, and underseas cables to Europe, but you couldn't have this instantaneous kind of communication that the telephone then offered. And when the telephone sort of supplanted the telegraph in the early 1900s, and really almost completely by the 1920s, 1930s, we had a kind of far superior sort of way to communicate.
Thanks, John. Interestingly, there were fears about advancing tech of telegraphs in the same way digital communications gives some people anxiety these days. Some feared the telegraph lines would, quote, in the world because they disrupted the planet's magnetic poles, leading to rainforest in Central Park and a deep freeze in Africa. In 1858, the New York Times wrote, quote, there can be no rational doubt that the telegraph has caused vast injury. It is superficial, sudden, unsifted, and it will render the popular mind too fast for truth. Meanwhile, around the same time, a Wellesley College newspaper headline ran, Wellesley co-eds are addicted to telegrams. So complaining about tech started off way before social media. Okay, next up, we're talking location, 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 because there were key tech hubs in Jersey, incubators of invention that contributed an insane amount of advancement in communications. Now, John, how does New Jersey help take communications into the electronic age proper?
In terms of communications, when they became electronic, is in many ways when New Jersey separated from the rest of the country as becoming a kind of leader in innovation. And really by being part of, or really the main driver of AT&T, American Telephone and Telegraph, which in that era was really a monopoly over all telephone communications in the country. Its laboratory, Bell Telephone Labs, employed really tens of thousands of people in New Jersey. In the very early days of Bell Telephone Laboratories, they were headquartered in downtown Manhattan. It was too noisy. They were doing a lot of sensitive research work on acoustics and vibrations. And they really wanted to create this almost Shangri-La where researchers, engineers, and scientists could all get together and work on new inventions that would secure the kind of future of telecommunications, kind of invent the future of the phone company. And they bought this large parcel of land, I think in the 1930s, but they didn't really develop it. And then World War II kind of got in the way. And right at the tail end of World War II, they started building really these large industrial buildings in Murray Hill. Eventually, it grew to five really just enormous areas for laboratories, for offices, for libraries, for a kind of almost self-sustaining laboratory that eventually grew to about 4,000 people working there. And by 1945, really, it was up and running. And that was really the beginning, I think, of the golden age of Bell Labs here in New Jersey. That was when these innovations that changed the world, like the transistor, telecommunication satellites, this idea of how to send information, digital information from one place to another, the laser, all sorts of really kind of world changing ideas came out of really this one laboratory during these few decades here in New Jersey between 1945 and really 1975. I mean, really at the start, Bell Labs was a place. It was a place in Manhattan that was established on January 1st, 1925, and moved to New Jersey to this very beautiful campus in Murray Hill, New Jersey, near New Providence and Berkeley Heights, in 1945 officially.
Now, is it true that they allowed scientists to pursue their own projects, kind of like Google?
Yeah, again, we're talking, more than 8,000, 10,000 scientists and engineers working really on this project of making present day communications better, but also creating the future of communications. So different scientists and different engineers had different roles. Some of them were very focused on improving the near term kind of functioning of the phone system and communications. But that's true. A lot of them were in this unit, which would have been kind of basic research. And a lot of the Nobel Prize winners came out of this. And this was a place where scientists and a few engineers could really pursue, I think, what we might call blue sky research, where they were kind of rewarded or almost hired to pursue their curiosity. And a lot of times these were, very, very brilliant people who were working in areas that were really not yet quite understood or developed. And some of them had very free form days where they really actually had to kind of figure out, really from scratch, what kinds of communications in the future there might be. Now, some of these ideas that won a Nobel Prize are really kind of esoteric and abstruse, like the quantum Hall fractional effect, things that don't necessarily mean much in our day to day lives. But other things that came out of Bell Labs have tremendous use. For instance, different kinds of microphones, like James West, who was an innovator at Bell Labs, who kind of came up with a prototype of basically most of the microphones in the world today, or some of the early lasers, or that are now used in every kind of light oriented switching system in the world. So this kind of marriage, I think, of practical devices, but also kind of theoretical breakthroughs that might not really have any kind of yet sort of understandable or pragmatic application, but that furthered our knowledge of how either messages are sent or physics works or acoustics might function. All these things came out of this one place in this one organization at this one point in time.
And is it true that evidence for the Big Bang also came from that office?
It did, and, that won the Nobel Prize, and again, what does the Big Bang have to do with kind of me calling you or us talking on this chat right now? And we kind of might wonder why. But, really, the Big Bang came out of some research into trying to understand why there was this background noise with one of these, kinds of, instruments that they were using in Bell Labs at the time. But the scientists Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson tried to figure out where this kind of background noise was coming from, and that led them to this realization that they were sort of understanding the origins of the universe. So, right, the phone company employed a couple scientists who actually found evidence of the Big Bang. It's really the odds are against it, and yet it happened here in New Jersey, actually right down by the Jersey Shore by Homedale.
If you were to suggest an incubator of New Jersey invention, which one would you like to talk about, Rayvon?
I would like to focus on the Nipper building, or what is the old RCA headquarters in Camden. Originally built by the Victor Talking Machine Company, which pioneered gramophones and vinyl records, or what we know as a wonderful new medium of listening to sound. In 1929, when Victor and RCA merged, they became a leading research enterprise around sound and music reproduction. A bit like Bell Labs, this was a global center of research and development that attracted some of the best engineers and scientists of the day. So it's important to think about the connection between space, place, and innovation, because right at that moment in time, the early 20s, there was an effort to institutionalized and systematized mass production invention. So from the late 18th century, you have companies like GE, Westinghouse, and RCA trying to institutionalize and create patentable infrastructure and inventions that were going to help move forward and shape the world. But not only did they develop advanced radio technologies over the years of the work that was happening at the Camden, New Jersey facility, they were leading contributors in the creation of things like color television, the electron microscope, LCD displays, color VCR, widescreen TVs, the first satellite dish systems for everyday consumers. So we have to understand these locations as hubs of innovative activity where lots of individuals were participating and contributing to the work that's going on and moving forward. The company was also a major producer of broadcast equipment for TV that helped their partner company, the National Broadcasting Corporation, or NBC, become a household name. But it's also important to think about global reach and scale. Their research was literally far reaching. For instance, they also contributed to the space race. In 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon, they communicated with each other and the rest of the world with a backpack system built at the Camden facility. So this is an example of the global nature and reach of the work that's going on in Camden, and how over much of the 20th century, innovation, invention, and design was an activity that was spawned by collaborative and collective action of individuals in similar spaces and places.
You mentioned the global nature of the work that was taking place. Can you talk a little bit more about the role collaboration played in supporting these technological innovations?
I mean, I think it's incredibly interesting. At one point in my life, I lived near the original General Electric facility, and um, lived in this neighborhood called the General GE Realty Plot. And it was where all the engineers and scientists lived. And it was a funny joke that everyone had a large piece of equipment left in their basement from the early 20th century. And actually, some of the first television signals were sent from General Electric to one of the houses in the neighborhood. So it's really amazing to be able to do that and create collectively and collaboratively. So it's a really interesting way to think about how technology and innovation is not just done by single solitary inventors and individuals, but it's a collaborative activity done by financiers, scientists, engineers, and designers to produce the technology that shapes our world.
And John, when you consider those two histories that you both talked about there, do you think comparing New Jersey in the 19th century to sort of a modern day Silicon Valley is too simplistic, or do you think it has some merit?
I think it's really valuable. I mean, in the sense that we can sort of see how the pursuit of new technology kind of evolves over time. I mean, the things that Rayvon was saying about the labs of GE and RCA, and the things that were common to Bell Labs, which is kind of a collaborative effort. A lot of times, people with different talents and different sensibilities working towards a kind of common pursuit. I think really that kind of is a very 20th century idea that you don't want to gather like-minded people necessarily, because the pursuit of new technology had become so complex that you needed people of all different kinds of expertise to actually invent the technologies of the future. So, for instance, at Bell Labs, you needed material scientists, you needed electrical engineers, you needed physicists, you needed chemists, and you needed them working in concert. They needed money, they needed they needed planning, they needed supervision, and they needed goals, and they needed good problems to solve whereby their technologies could be applied actually to something useful. Now, I think in Silicon Valley, that mindset prevails in some places. I think in some ways software has changed things. Software does not necessarily require a laboratory where you have, burners and, gases piped in and all sorts of other things. And you might not need a kind of larger group of expertise, but you might need sort of different kinds of talents to make it work. I think one other difference between today's Silicon Valley and these software innovations, is that they can be rolled out sometimes much faster than a lot of these innovations we talk about in hardware or electronics, where sometimes the ideas kind of took decades to actually produce, or to, we talk about how to define an innovation, something that had impact and scale. So, for instance, the first idea for how to map out a cellular network came out of Bell Labs in 1947, but really it wasn't realized until much, much later, until the late 1970s in Philadelphia, that they started actually building a real, live, useful cellular network. So, what we have now is software in Silicon Valley, where sometimes there is a collaborative approach, but it comes out much quicker. And I think it's a different kind of or animal in that sense of things.
And that's the question I'd like to get both of your takes on. Why do you think New Jersey had this pioneering culture of invention? What were the factors that contributed to the history of innovation that you both described?
There's a long history and tradition of technological innovation on the East Coast, I would say from New York City to Washington, D.C., and all parts in between. And there has been a lot of activity and energy around that. And what makes that place unique is, like, I would just say, the history and tradition of innovation and invention. And part of what was interesting about it is that the world was much smaller, not necessarily geographically, but research wise. And so you have these hubs of innovation and activity that would grow in a certain location and place, and the people would live and exist there. And similarly, right, most of the like elite research and technological universities um, are located within this, I would say, New York, Washington, D.C. to Schenectady, Albany. They are all in this relatively small geographical area. And so that allowed the innovation, the creativity to develop and move forward and spawn through this collective action. So in this geographical place, we get everything from the light bulbs to radio to all kinds of things happening in this specific location and space. So I think what geographically, right, New Jersey is kind of in the center of that place. So as people are moving north, south, east, and west, you roll through New Jersey, and I think that helps that creative energy flow.
Yeah, I might just add, and it's sort of embedded in some of what Rayvon was saying, is that, we look at the question of resources, and it could be, the universities are a big part of that, but the corporations that actually funded this research were, they were, whether it was General Electric or whether it was AT&T, they were located here. And, that they could build these big laboratories and attract talent, some of it local talent, some of it from other universities, University of Chicago, or people at Caltech coming east here to really spend the rest of their lives working in these, really well appointed laboratories where they had all sorts of resources, all sorts of access to other smart people, other new technologies, that they could, they had this kind of raw material to work on invention and innovation. And I think as a footnote to that, you can look at sort of the 1950s and 1960s when Stanford created sort of these incentives to bring innovators to its innovation sort of works out in California, which where William Shockley from Bell Labs actually went back out to California, and became a kind of pivotal figure in creating a kind of new semiconductor transistor company. So, I think the West Coast and some of those schools picked up on this idea that you really want that place is important, that actually funding and resources and creating the right environment for innovators and for those who want to create new technology is crucially important. But I think if we're looking at that sort of 19th and 20th century sort of incredible boom, explosion of new ideas and inventions, really, we'd be looking at New Jersey and really the metro area as the place where so much of it went down.
Let's move on to outer space. Rayvon, what happened at Camp Evans, and why is it important that the world know about it today?
Well, I think what's interesting about Camp Evans and its connection to the space race is that it's one of the early places where engineers, scientists were coming together to think about what does it mean to innovate, at least in the geopolitical um, politics of the post-war period. And so when we think about the space race, this effort to reach the moon between the United States and the Soviet Union, Camp Evans in Wall Township in New Jersey plays an interesting and important role. Because what is happening is the engineers of Project Diana, under direction of the Pentagon and the various other parts of the military, became the first institution or organization to bounce radio transmissions off the moon and receive them back at Earth. So in many ways, it seems to be very simple or basic effort and activity, but it's actually a really transformative development that allows to us to think more broadly about what does it mean to travel in space. Uh, so not only could the planets in the solar system be mapped for the first time, it opened the possibilities for radio communication from space probes, later astronauts, later satellites, and choose your thing that's floating out in space back to Earth. So what's interesting to me as a person who studies Black folks and technology is there are a lot of um, Black technologists, scientists, and engineers who are involved in the production of new innovation and knowledge. And one of the persons I would like to speak about is Walter Samuel McAfee, whose theoretical calculations determined the feasibility of this original kind of radar moon bounce activity. McAfee was one of the very few Black scientists with advanced degree in physics at the time. And on January 10th, 1946, the experiment he designed using his calculations was conducted successfully. And this achievement became one of the kind of hallmarks of the origin and the beginning of what we call now the space race and the space age. So it's interesting to think about the ways in which Camp Evans as site location, New Jersey, helped to build this research activity that leads into this long arc of the space race and moon landings and research around the world.
And can you give us a sense of how rare it was for a man like McAfee to be working on such a high profile project during this time period?
I mean, I think in most when we think about the world in which we live in 1940s, 50s, 60s, the United States, it's deeply segregated. It takes to the 1960s with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act to actually think more broadly about having a place in space for racial equality. So the idea of a black scientist working in a research space, developing new technologies and protocols and systems for doing science in the late 40s is rather unique. McAfee is a pretty special guy, very smart individual, and the only way these folks were able to survive was just being spectacular at their jobs and their work and their calculations. So very unique, but in many ways not so unique in a place like New Jersey and the East Coast, where there are a lot of opportunities for. Well, I should say a lot of opportunities. There are more opportunities for Black folks and people of color to exist within these research facilities and institutions.
Are there any other figures that come to mind that are similar to Walter McAfee that you'd like to highlight?
Well, I mean, I think they're two kind of categories. I would say we think about the wonderful film Hidden Figures, which really highlights folks like Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson, who are calculators within NASA's early space program, which end up being the foundation for a lot of calculations that help us do all kinds of things globally and spatially. And then similarly, someone like Jim West, who pioneers microphone technology and sets the foundation for how we think about actually communicating and recording sound. And I think those are kind of conceptual individuals of this moment in time that allow us to think about the ways in which marginalized communities, and particularly Black folks specifically, were able to navigate these worlds in racially adversarial way through the production of scientific knowledge and research.
Staying with the theme of space, Telstar was made in New Jersey. What was Telstar and how big was its impact?
Yeah, Telstar was the first active communication satellite, and it had a tremendous impact. It was, you can read recollections of people who couldn't believe that they could actually get this sort of instantaneous visual television signal from other continents, which is really what it allowed for. Um, Telstar actually had a predecessor called Echo, which was a passive satellite, which was also a Bell Labs product, that sort of tested the concept out of, could we have a communication satellite? So together, Echo and Telstar really kind of set the I guess pattern for what eventually has become not just governments involved in satellite communications, but private companies too, using space as a kind of vehicle for connecting the world, not just in terms of sound, but visually in terms of instantaneous, television signals. Um, and Telstar, last I checked, is still up there. It's not working anymore. It's just a kind of piece of space junk. So it's been replaced by all these other SpaceX satellites and everything else that's kind of going around the world. But it's strange to think that when these things were launched in the early 1960s, really, low Earth orbit was a pretty empty place, and now it has something I just read today: 14,000 active satellites circling the Earth. So, these were path breaking ideas that were put into practice and actually, really did work and changed the face of communications.
An early demonstration of Telstar consisted of broadcasting a live baseball game between the Cubs and the Phillies, which took place in the United States to an audience in Europe. Lyndon Johnson called the chairman of AT&T, a guy who invested over $1 billion in the project, to mark the occasion. What was the purpose of this broadcast, and what was the significance of this moment?
So, you mentioned the showing of the Cubs versus the Phillies. I don't think there are that many baseball fans and the UK at the time. So it was not for the English audience to consume the baseball game. It was about showing one thing that Americans would love and appreciate to a larger audience and communicating broadly. And so, right, with Telstar, you could have chosen all kinds of different people to make that phone call. But of course, you chose the president of the United States and the CEO of AT&T. And right, that was not the first moment they had done that experiment. They had, I'm sure, I don't know enough of the details, but I'm sure they did a lot of work to make sure that was going to come off very, very well when they did it. And so part of it is the performative nature of technological innovation at this moment as well.
It's amazing what this satellite did, given it's only 35 inches in diameter. Sticking with space, John, can you tell us who made the first satellite telephone call?
Let's see. I mean, the first, I think, satellite voice communication was, I believe, a pre-recorded message from Dwight Eisenhower that was played in New Jersey. Is that? I don't know. It's not a quiz, I realize, but I've done trying to think back on something I researched about 15 years ago. That's right. So it would have been the night that the Echo satellite was launched into space, and they played a pre-recorded message, and it went up from California. It was bounced off the Echo satellite. In technical terms, the Echo satellite was a passive satellite. It didn't have active electronics, so it was really almost a kind of reflector of sorts. And this message, this recorded message from Dwight Eisenhower, came down to New Jersey to Crawford Hill, a small laboratory of Bell Labs, and was played over the loudspeakers there that evening. I remember reading up on some people and interviewing some people that night. When they heard the message, they actually thought it was live. They didn't know it was coming through and that it was coming from California, and being going through space and then back down to New Jersey. And for a lot of people there that evening, it was pretty revelatory.
And it was the first ever satellite telephone call. On the day after its launch, the New York Times called it a communications feat rivaling the significance of the first telegraph transmission by Samuel Morse more than a century before. John, what do you think of that characterization of Telstar, connecting it back to the creation of Morse code?
Yeah. I mean, I think in some ways it gets to the heart of how these weren't just kind of technological breakthroughs, but really kind of big cultural moments too. I mean, Telstar not only kind of connected people through sports internationally and international events, I think it was even like a number one hit for a band that created the song Telstar right after the satellite was launched. So it became almost a like kind of catchphrase about new technology and a kind of, brave new world or the like that was here. But again, speaking to how innovations and communications, from New Jersey and elsewhere, not only just changed the nature of technology, changed how people spoke to one another, changed how news was communicated and shared, but also changed to some extent the culture and accelerated it in many ways.
This is a question for both of you. Why do you think the center of innovation or culture, certainly in the popular imagination, has moved away from the East Coast more towards the West Coast? And do you think it could ever be brought back? John, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I think in some ways, the companies that originally sort of spawned some of these laboratories kind of hit a bit of a demise. I mean, certainly the breakup of the phone company, which probably in many ways was good for consumers, was not really great for Bell Labs, it at all. I mean, it sort of fractured this very large dynamic laboratory into a lot of different pieces, and that kind of collaborative, sort of, crucial kind of density of good minds and good problems was broken apart. Now, at the same time that some of these companies were sort of hitting hard times, whether it was General Electric or whether it was AT&T, a lot of companies were spreading out nationally. They were putting their labs in other areas. The West Coast, certainly Stanford and other places, were investing in kind of creating new places where innovators could work. I think it's worth saying probably that a lot of these innovations that were created by the labs in the sort of mid part of the 20th century were kind of almost sort of these foundational inventions, platform innovations, we might call, that allowed for other kinds of innovations on top of them. For instance, I think the advent or sort of increasing kind of um, evolution of digital communications obviously allowed for the internet and software and all sorts of other things built upon this kind of electronic platform and electronic foundation that was created by a lot of these East Coast companies. And of course, it turns out, as we all know, that you don't need a lab of 1,000 computer scientists and physicists to create a social media company that can change the world. You might just want to start it in your garage with 3 or 4 friends. And eventually that can grow, but, as, we see from Microsoft or Facebook or Google or a host of other companies, the costs and the challenges to starting that up aren't what they were back in the early days of the 1900s.
Now, Rayvon, do you agree that geographic location is less important these days in the process of technological development? Or is something lost when innovators are no longer all physically gathered in the same space?
Yeah, I mean, I think John kind of hit it on the head is that it's the technological landscape has changed. Um, there's not the same requirements of physical space. The idea when you think about Bell Labs or research infrastructure in New Jersey, take medicine laboratories, are massive. Uh, Now everything has been miniaturized. There's not the necessity for people to be in place at the same time. So, right, we moved from a world where in the early 20th century, where if you like to have a meeting with someone, you literally had to kind of walk across the hallway and sit down with them. Now we're having this recording happen on a digital platform. So the in-personness is different. And I wouldn't say one's better or worse. It's just a different kind of innovative activity and pathway. But folks are trying to restart that effort. So the National Science Foundation has created this program centered on regional innovation engines. And so it's trying to lean into what was going on in New Jersey in the early 20th century, what was going on in Silicon Valley in the mid part of the century. How do we create locations and spaces where people with similar ideas and questions come together and innovate? Uh, and I think the questions people are asking are large and global. I mean, as we think about the conversation about artificial intelligence, I think John was really correct in that you don't need to be in the same room to do this. And now corporations are no longer, I would say, bound by nation state or local geographical borders. I mean, they're global. And when you move global, there's not such a need and focus in saying we're going to have this specific group of people coming together to innovate together over a long period of time. I think they do that in small periods, but I think one of the things that's really important about the research laboratories in New Jersey is that they were running for decades. And the longitudinal work that was developed month over year for year is decidedly different from people that work in the current landscape as well. And so when we think about researchers at Bell Labs, RCA, those people stayed for decades. And now we're moving to a moment where researchers are moving from company to company. And so what does it mean for a researcher to work at Google, Apple, Microsoft over a 10-year span, as opposed to someone who worked at Bell Labs for 45 years? And that's a different level of institutional knowledge that gets reproduced and shared.
In 1858, the New York Times wrote of the telegraph, quote, "There can be no rational doubt that the telegraph has caused vast injury. It is superficial, sudden, unsifted, and will render the popular mind too fast for truth." Is there anything to be learned from the fear technology created in the past with some of the echoes that we're feeling today? Rayvon, if you'd like, you can take that one first.
Yeah, I mean, I think technology has always created a level of fear and concern and anxiety. And it's the creation of the unknown. And so many of these technologies that we're talking about don't seem to have a grounding in reality. So the idea, right, there's wonderful stories about early radio and people having huge concerns and reservations and destabilized because of what is this phantom voice coming out of this machine. Um, so, I mean, when we're thinking about it, until the creation of the phonograph, there was no mechanism to have pre-recorded sound. So, right, it didn't exist. in a sense. So we go from music being live to be recorded, and that's a huge cognitive shift in the way we think about music and sound. So I think what we can learn from that is the fear and the hype and hyperbole about these technologies. But part of what that narrative also is about is that oftentimes new emerging technologies can heavily oversell that they're going to change how we exist in our world. And oftentimes many of the technologies don't deliver that, but eventually they will. And I think this is what's interesting about so much of the work at Bell Labs. And I think that's why that laboratory space is so revered, is that many of the things that were produced and created at that lab built the foundation of our modern technological world. And it's very hard to think about a laboratory space. And, who knows with Google and Microsoft and Meta and Apple that may materialize in another 40, 50 years, but we don't know yet. But I think part of it is that, yeah, we can learn from that historical past that new emerging technologies are always concerning and fearful to our society because it destabilizes how we live and exist. And what does it mean to actually integrate new things into our world which weren't there before, and question how we interact with each other, how we communicate, how we share information, and how we live.
But John, if I can ask the same question to you, and also an additional one, do you think AI is fundamentally different to those technologies?
Yeah, Rayvon used the word destabilize, which I think is a really apt term for this. And the fear of new technology is real, whether it plays out in some instances or others. I mean, sometimes the fear is justified if we look at nuclear weapons and the advent of those and sort of what they engender, and sometimes not. And I think I think one thing that came out of my research into Bell Labs is just how almost inevitable it is that solving one problem, technologically speaking, seems to create another or others. And sometimes those are foreseen and sometimes those are unforeseen. And we look at the sort of breakthroughs of digital communications and then we look at what it's rendered on the web with instantaneous communication and websites and connection, but also misinformation and all sorts of kinds of loneliness. I think people using the web or using digital communications in lieu of real human connections. So again, the solving of one problem, the creation of another, and technology always seems to have that kind of double-edged sort of result. And, I think with artificial intelligence, I'd like to say I know how this is going to play out, but sometimes I think history is helpful. And sometimes in this respect, I'm not always sure. I actually would put myself in the camp of somebody who's a little bit concerned, not so much because AI will take over the world in some sort of science fiction type kind of vision, but just because of the vast sums that are being put into it, the small number of people that control it, the sort of sense that it's somehow, for a lot of people, an excuse to sort of not think or maybe to sort of lean on it too heavily for creativity. And I think for AI too, there's a sort of original sin with how it was built from actual human information that was scrubbed off the web, which I think is has been a problem too. So we don't know how AI will play out. We don't know how robotics can play out, but I think the fear or mistrust, we may someday look back on it and say, wasn't that silly that we were concerned about it? But I think that's a natural human emotion, and I think those warning signs can actually benefit us if we talk about them and listen to them and sort of discuss them in a way that I don't think we're doing as much as maybe we should right now.
Well, gentlemen, is there anything else you wanted to say that we haven't touched on today?
I just had one thing when I we talk about
And
innovation, and this will be a real quick point. I mean, innovation in New Jersey, and whether it's RCA or Bell Labs, or whether we look up to Westchester for General Electric, these laboratories were huge in scale and in resources and in the number of people. These tens of thousands of scientists and engineers over the course of a century who work there. And I talk a lot about how it's changed our technology and changed our communication systems and in many ways changed our culture. But sometimes I'm reminded also just of these kind of downstream trickle down effects of just how many people depended on those paychecks that came out of these innovations. So, an innovation isn't just, some new nifty way to kind of communicate. It also just, at least in New Jersey, and at least so many households and people I knew and grew up with depended on those Bell Labs paychecks to go to college or to, whatever it might have been, to pay their rent, to pay off their car loans. And so when we look at innovation, it does have not just kind of technological implications, it just has everyday real world implications for keeping a local economy and eventually a national economy moving. And I think that's a real important point. We say, like, well, why does innovation matter? And we also tend to focus a little bit too much sometimes on only the technology and not so much on the sociology, maybe.
The only piece that I would add is that, right, all of the research that's happening within New Jersey requires huge injections of capital. And I think oftentimes in the context of New Jersey, so many people think about New York City being the financial hub, but New Jersey is also a clear financial hub. And there's a lot of resources flowing through New Jersey that was supporting the infrastructure of Bell Labs. And I think connected to John is like, it just wasn't the laboratories, it was the tendrils of money that was embedding itself within the communities in New Jersey. So the spread of the capital down the financial ladder was very important and changes New Jersey fundamentally.
The OG Silicon Valley. I'm officially renaming it that. The tech innovation from New Jersey is insane. We could go on and on about this topic, but we're out of time. If you want more on this, check out the links to the great tech historical sites that you can visit around New Jersey in our show notes, where there is more info on all that we spoke about today. Make sure also to subscribe to our series and give us 5 stars. I want to thank our guests for joining us today, Jon Gertner and Rayvon Fouché. Thank you so much for your wonderful insight into the great history of tech innovation in New Jersey.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
Also, be sure to listen to our next episode when it drops, How New Jersey Became a Battlefield. Garden State Roots is digging up some stories.